They say history is written by the victors. But what if I told you that some of the darkest truths were buried on purpose? Secrets so twisted, so violently intimate, that they were never meant to see the light of day. Tonight, I'm going to take you into one of those forbidden shadows, into a story so shocking, so grotesquely cruel, that it shatters the very idea of justice and power as you know it. Picture it, Louisiana, 1846. A man of wealth, influence, and arrogance, a planter whose life was built on domination, decides to punish not with chains, but with marriage. A union twisted not by love, but by control. This man, known in hushed whispers as a figure of authority, selected a woman who weighed over 400 pounds. To him, she was a weapon, a tool of humiliation. He saw her size, her body, as the perfect instrument for his perverse sense of justice, a punishment crafted in cruelty, a lesson in his own warped superiority. But here's the part that history textbooks will never teach you. She was no passive victim. She was a storm waiting for a spark. Beneath the surface, beneath the flesh that he thought marked weakness, there was a mind sharp, calculating, and then yielding. This was a woman who understood the balance of power in ways he could never imagine. Every glance, every smile, every step toward the altar was a step deeper into a trap he could not see, a trap that he had built himself. As the wedding night fell, the house, opulent, gilded, a monument to his ego, was transformed into a theater of dread. Candles flickered like nervous breaths. The air was heavy, thick with expectation, and with death. For centuries, men like him believed that dominance could bend reality itself, that control was absolute, that fear could subdue will. But they forgot one immutable truth. The mind that is forced to submit can, in a moment, become the hand of annihilation. And so it happened. On that night, the punishment he designed became his undoing. His arrogance, his cruelty, his hunger for power, it all collapsed under the weight of the one he thought he owned. History, written in hushed whispers, records only fragments, a scream, a crash, the finality of human strength unbound. Tonight, we are going to dissect every layer of this story, not as a sensational tale, but as a warning. Power, when wielded without conscience, can blind the wielder, and those who think themselves untouchable often fall first. By the end of this descent, you will understand the real terror of control, the hidden systems that manipulate men like him, and the truths they tried to erase from memory. This isn't just a story of death. It's a story of awakening. What you need to understand first is the mind of a man like him. He was a product of a system designed to breed arrogance, entitlement, and a sense of invincibility. Wealth, status, and absolute control over the lives of others had convinced him that he could orchestrate reality itself. He believed that people were nothing more than tools, pieces on a board he moved with ease. And in his mind, punishing a woman by forcing her into marriage was not cruelty. It was instruction. But here's the first lesson most men never learn. Power is never absolute. It is always conditional. And it is always temporary. When you treat another human as less than yourself, you plant the seeds of your own destruction. The planter, in his twisted logic, thought he could humiliate, dominate, and then walk away unscathed. He never considered that the human body, mind, and spirit contain a capacity for revolt that no amount of social control can suppress. She had lived her life under chains. Yes, but chains do not break the mind. They only sharpen it. And in her, those chains had forged a dangerous clarity. Every insult, every calculated indignity, every glance of condescension he threw at her became fuel. He thought her weight was her weakness, her limitation. But what he could not see was the raw power that it represented. She carried the potential to crush him, and he walked toward it blind, intoxicated by his own certainty. On the night of the wedding, the psychology of dominance became the theater of terror. He entered that room convinced that tradition, law, and society would shield him. But psychological control is a fragile thing, a veneer over something darker. The moment he attempted to assert authority, he underestimated the fundamental truth. Fear is not submission. Fear is awareness. And awareness can become weaponized in a single heartbeat. The mechanisms of control, which he relied on, status, intimidation, brute strength, collapsed instantly under her will. The scene that followed was both grotesque and inevitable. In the space of one night, the man who thought he dictated reality discovered a truth older than civilization itself. When a human mind and body are pushed beyond depression, it can strike with devastating force. And this is where most histories lie. They erase the details, sanitize the horror, and turn rebellion into rumor. But what we are uncovering here is not just a story of vengeance. It's a mirror. It's a lesson in power, manipulation, and the illusions that men cling to when they believe themselves untouchable. Tonight, we are peeling away the curtain. We are entering the mechanics of control, the systems, the assumptions, the lies, and watching them fail spectacularly. This is forbidden knowledge, dangerous knowledge, and if you understand it fully, you will never look at power the same way again. To truly grasp what happened, you must look beyond the bedroom, beyond the house, beyond the immediate horror. This was not an isolated act. It was the product of a society built on suppression, secrecy, and cruelty disguised as order. In 1846, power was a currency more valuable than gold. It flowed through laws, through land, through human bodies, and those at the top wielded it like gods, believing themselves untouchable, immortal, above consequence. He was a cog in a much larger machine, a system designed to strip people of autonomy and bend them to will. Slavery was not only a physical imprisonment, it was a psychological empire. Fear, humiliation, and isolation were engineered tools of control. And yet, the same system that tried to break spirits also contained a spark for revolt. Every institution that sought to dominate humans underestimated one thing: the unpredictability of the human mind. In this case, the planter's arrogance blinded him to that unpredictability. He assumed that tradition, property laws, and social expectation gave him absolute authority over her body and life. He did not realize that obedience cannot exist in a vacuum. It requires the compliance of the mind. And the mind, even when trapped, is capable of profound subversion. Her size, which he mocked, was not her limitation. It was her advantage. Every pound, every breath, every inch of her presence became a conduit of latent power. This is where the story becomes more than a historical anecdote. It becomes a lesson in psychological control, in the illusions of dominance. He believed the system was on his side. He believed that the social hierarchy, the legal framework, and the moral blindness of his peers insulated him from consequences. But no system is perfect. No hierarchy is absolute. And no punishment imposed by force can override the inevitability of resistance when the oppressed are pushed past the threshold. By forcing her into marriage as a punishment, he created a perfect paradox. The act meant to subjugate her became the trap that destroyed him. This was a classic case of hubris meeting inevitability. His entire worldview, built on domination and fear, collapsed in the space of a single night. History remembers him in fragments, some as legend, some as rumor. But the truth is far more revealing. He underestimated the mechanics of human rebellion. And here's the chilling pattern that repeats through time. Societies that claim moral superiority often incubate their own destruction. Institutions that preach order frequently unleash chaos. And men who believe they are untouchable are always the first to fall. Tonight, we will continue to peel back layer after layer. You will see how punishment becomes prophecy, how systems of control fail, and how the darkest acts of cruelty often sow the seeds of the most absolute vengeance. The night arrived like a slow storm, thick with anticipation, drenched in the stench of arrogance and dread. Every candle flickered as though whispering warnings. Every shadow stretched unnaturally long across the polished floors. He entered the room, the embodiment of self-assured dominance. Satan that fear had already bent her will. He did not hear it, but the house itself seemed to hold its breath. She was waiting, quiet, almost motionless, yet every inch of her presence radiated latent power. Her body, which he had weaponized in his mind as a tool of shame, now filled the room with an undeniable force. There was a psychological elegance to her stillness, a deliberate patience that he could not comprehend. Men like him are trained to act, to seize control, to impose will, and that very assumption blinds them. He assumed that action would crush resistance. But here, restraint was lethal. The first moments were deceptively mundane. Words were exchanged, formalities observed. But beneath the surface, a battle raged, one of intent, of dominance, of prediction. Every gesture, every inflection, every glance was a test of power. He did not realize that she had studied him, calculated his strength, anticipated his arrogance. She had been observing him long before the wedding, learning the mechanics of fear that he relied upon, and now she was poised to exploit them. And then came the moment, the instant where control slipped like sand through his fingers. Perhaps he reached for dominance. Perhaps he leaned on physical assertion. It doesn't matter. What matters is the inversion of power in that room. The man who thought himself untouchable was suddenly, completely vulnerable. Her size, her presence, which had been the subject of ridicule, became the instrument of obliteration. Every physical assertion he attempted was met with an equal and devastating counter. It is here that history becomes visceral. The accounts, sparse and whispered, describe a soundless struggle transformed into absolute finality. He collapsed under her force, the house reverberating with the inevitability of his undoing. In that moment, centuries of societal arrogance, centuries of systemic control, all converged and broke. The punisher became the punished. The controller became controlled. And the line between fear and power shattered completely. This is why men are drawn to forbidden histories. It is not the spectacle of death, but the lesson beneath it. Power is a fragile illusion. Control, even when reinforced by law, money, and muscle, is temporary. And those who think themselves untouchable often fail to see the storm that has been quietly gathering in the margins, in the underestimated, in the oppressed. In the next section, we will explore her mind, the calculation, the patience, the psychology of survival and vengeance that turned the very punishment intended to humiliate her into the ultimate reversal of power. To understand what happened that night, you must enter her mind. Most histories erase her agency, reduce her to a footnote, a victim. But she was neither passive nor broken. Every insult, every forced submission, every glance of derision had been carefully catalogued. She understood the nature of power, not as a brute force, but as a living, manipulable current. And she had learned to move through it with precision. Her body, which he had weaponized in his imagination, became a tool of strategy. 400 pounds, something he saw as limitation, was transformed into leverage, into inevitability. She had studied the contours of his arrogance, the way he gestured, the rhythm of his breathing when he assumed dominance. Men like him operate on predictability. They rely on repetition, on patterns they believe are under their control. But patterns can be exploited, and weakness disguised as strength can become the deadliest weapon. She did not act out of rage alone. This was not a spontaneous explosion. It was cold, deliberate, and unavoidable. Every second leading to the confrontation had been a rehearsal in her mind, a mental mapping of the steps that would end him. While he saw himself as the puppeteer, she had quietly rewritten the script. Every calculation he made, every assumption he relied upon, was used against him. The moment of collapse was not luck. It was the result of a mind trained in observation, patience, and subtle mastery. There is a truth here that is rarely spoken aloud. Control, when wielded without understanding the other mind, is a fool's illusion. And the system that empowered him, the laws, the social structures, the institutions that codified oppression, provided him with confidence, and therefore, blind spots. He underestimated the very thing he sought to dominate. And that underestimation is the seed of his destruction. In the silence before the final act, she was not waiting in fear. She was orchestrating inevitability. The house, the candles, the gilded walls, they were witnesses, not accomplices. The ultimate lesson here is psychological. Strength does not always reside in muscle or status. It resides in awareness, in strategic patience, in the capacity to see beyond immediate appearances and act with precision when the moment demands it. What he saw as punishment became the instrument of his demise. And this inversion of power is not an isolated event. It is a principle that echoes throughout history. Those who fail to recognize the intelligence, the potential, the latent force in the weaker or submissive often awaken only to disaster too late. In the next section, we will explore the aftermath, the ripple effects, the whispered rumors, and how society tried desperately to erase the evidence of this reversal of power. The aftermath of that night was chaos wrapped in silence. Society could not admit what had happened, not fully. The narrative had to be controlled, sanitized, erased. A man of wealth and influence dying in the hands of the one he sought to humiliate was a truth too destabilizing to tolerate. Gossip spread in hushed tones. Whispers behind closed doors attempted to rationalize the impossible. He was reduced to rumor, his arrogance folded into legend, but the woman, her existence, became dangerous knowledge, a living threat to the fragile illusions of control. Institutions, both formal and informal, acted quickly. Friends, neighbors, local authorities, all complicit in maintaining the facade of order, worked to reshape the story. They understood something instinctively. The event challenged the very structures that upheld their society. If the lesson spread too widely, that the oppressed could strike back with precision and inevitability, it might awaken fear, uncertainty, even rebellion in others who had been conditioned to obey. And so, truth was hidden. Records were destroyed, accounts sanitized, the woman's role minimized, almost erased. But history cannot fully erase. Fragments survive in rumor, in folklore, in the trembling acknowledgement of witnesses who dared not speak. Those fragments reveal patterns repeated across centuries. Societies that codify oppression invariably produce moments of violent inversion. They reveal a universal law of human dynamics. The stronger the attempt to dominate, the more concentrated the force of potential retaliation becomes. In her, the system had underestimated both patience and cunning. The punishment he designed had been transformed into inevitability. This is more than just a story of vengeance. It is a study in systemic failure. It is a lesson in arrogance, hubris, and the blind spots created by hierarchical control. Institutions, traditions, even law itself, are fragile constructs when confronted with the unpredictability of human intelligence and physical power. The planter believed that rules, social status, and brute strength were immutable. He discovered that immutability is an illusion, and the cost of miscalculation is fatal. And here's the point men rarely see: awareness is power. Understanding patterns, recognizing hidden variables, and anticipating outcomes. These are the skills the powerful rarely cultivate. They rely on fear and force, failing to realize that the one they seek to dominate may already be rewriting reality in their minds. Halfway through this journey, it's time to anchor yourself. If you understand the invasion of power we're uncovering, comment twice below. I see the truth, and I own it. This locks your awareness, signals your engagement, and begins a subtle transformation. Comment it now. Twice. In the next section, we will delve deeper into the structural lessons hidden in this story, examining how control systems fail and the mechanics of psychological domination unravel under pressure. Now, let's dissect the system itself, the machinery of control that the planter trusted and that ultimately betrayed him. Societies like his were built on hierarchy, obedience, and the illusion that power flows from position alone. Wealth, social standing, legal authority. These are the instruments people mistake for invincibility. But any machine, no matter how well-oiled, contains weak points. And human nature, when pushed, exploits them mercilessly. He relied on intimidation, on the assumption that fear could subdue will. He trusted that the very framework of oppression, the laws, customs, and rituals that elevated him above her, was unbreakable. But here lies the first forbidden truth. Every system designed to dominate contains its own vulnerability. When someone understands the rules, studies the architecture of control, and calculates every move, the very tools of oppression can be turned inside out. This is what she did. She recognized the patterns, the assumptions, the predictable arrogance embedded in his mind and reinforced by society. Every gesture of superiority, every act of control, became data. And like a master strategist, she mapped the architecture of his ego, tracing every weakness with surgical precision. The instruments of his authority, his status, his size, his money, were illusions, scaffolding without real power when confronted with deliberate human intelligence and will. Men like him rarely grasp this. They confuse possession for control, fear for submission, law for morality. But dominance built solely on coercion is always fragile. True power is anticipatory, adaptive, and invisible until deployed. She wielded it without display, like a shadow, until the moment of finality arrived. And when it did, all the systems, all the rules, all the structures that he relied upon crumbled in an instant. This is the psychology of forbidden history. It reveals the fragility beneath apparent strength. It teaches a dangerous lesson. Power can be dismantled by precision, by understanding, by exploiting blind spots that arrogance cannot perceive. Systems are fragile. People are unpredictable. And those who fail to respect the intelligence of others risk catastrophic failure. Tonight, as we descend further into this story, you must internalize this principle. Every hierarchical structure, every institution that promises protection through dominance, contains the potential for complete reversal. Those who seem untouchable are only so long as they remain ignorant of the subtle currents of resistance flowing beneath them. The pivot, the moment when dominance fractures, is always psychological first, physical second. Before any act of destruction, there's awareness. The planter believed he was in control because he had conditioned himself to see obedience, to expect compliance, to interpret silence as submission. But silence is deceptive. It is a vacuum that can hide calculation, patience, and latent force. She had learned him. Every twitch, every gesture, every instinct born of arrogance was catalogued. In human interaction, the smallest microexpression, a tightening jaw, a twitch of the hand, a glance at the wrong moment, can reveal strategy. She observed all of it. And here's the key. Men in positions of power often misread stillness as weakness. In reality, stillness is often the most dangerous posture. It is awareness crystallized into potential energy. As the night progressed, tension built, not like a slow burn, but a precise accumulation of inevitability. Every move he made to assert dominance reinforced her calculations. Every verbal command, every attempt at intimidation, became a data point he failed to see was being weaponized against him. His mind, trained to predict others, could not predict her. He assumed the predictable patterns of fear and submission applied universally. He assumed the rules of power were immutable. He was wrong. The shift occurred in a heartbeat, the subtle inversion of expectation. In human psychology, perception defines reality. He perceived control, she perceived opportunity. And when perception aligns with action, reality itself bends. The physical act that ended his life was not brute force alone. It was inevitability made manifest. Her awareness, her calculation, her patience created a moment where his downfall could no longer be avoided. This is the lesson hidden in the darkness. Power is fragile. Control is an illusion unless it is understood by both mind and body. Dominance relies not only on strength, but on the miscalculation of the other's awareness. She exploited his arrogance, his assumptions, his reliance on systemic authority, and turned them into the mechanisms of his annihilation. Most men never see this coming. They confuse intimidation for obedience, coercion for loyalty. They ignore the warning signs hidden in silence, in observation, in subtle energy, and they pay the ultimate price. This is why forbidden histories matter. They reveal the anatomy of failure, the mechanics of collapse, and the inevitability of consequence when power is exercised without true comprehension. When the night ended, the house did not simply fall silent. It became a tomb of shattered illusions. The planter, the man who believed himself untouchable, was gone. The instruments of his dominance, wealth, status, size, and fear, lay in ruins. And around him, the system that had elevated him trembled. People did not understand what had happened, yet they instinctively recognized its danger. A single act had undone not just a man, but the very assumptions upon which society rested. Neighbors whispered in fear, colleagues in disbelief, and authorities in denial. No law could fully codify this moment. No social code could adequately explain it. It was chaos in human form, a literal collapse of hierarchy. And so the narrative was rewritten. The woman, who had acted with precision and inevitability, became a ghost in history. Her agency was minimized, her method erased, her intelligence obscured. It was easier for society to pretend she was a passive victim, and he, some tragic figure of circumstance, rather than acknowledge the terrifying truth. He had been undone by someone he thought powerless. This is the pattern that repeats across forbidden histories. Events that disrupt power structures are often silenced, erased, or mythologized. The system protects itself by rewriting reality, by sanitizing terror, by controlling perception. But the truth remains, hidden in fragments, rumors, anecdotes, whispers passed down in shadowed rooms. And those fragments are often more instructive than any textbook. They reveal the vulnerability of dominance, the precision of revenge, the fragility of arrogance. The psychological lesson here is brutal but essential. Power can blind. Systems can fail. And the mind that is underestimated may carry the tools of annihilation. His arrogance was a vector of his destruction. His assumptions about control, absolute and unchallengeable, were exploited. And society, unwilling to face this lesson, buried it, ensuring that men would continue to miscalculate, assuming their own infallibility. There is also a darker truth. History is rarely impartial. It serves those in power, sanitizes the inconvenient, and erases the inconvenient actors. The woman's story survived only in whispers because her existence threatened the structure of control. And that is why forbidden knowledge is dangerous. It forces men to confront uncomfortable truths. The tools of dominance can be inverted, the oppressed can strike with precision, and no amount of status, wealth, or intimidation guarantees safety. Beyond the historical record, this event enters the realm of myth. Legends grow from moments that defy ordinary comprehension, and what happened that night was nothing short of archetypal. The tale of a man undone by the one he sought to dominate carries symbolic weight. It reflects a universal truth about power, control, and the inversion of expectation. In myths, the weak strike, the overlooked rebel triumphs, and the mighty fall. Hey, history and myth converge in a brutal, unforgettable lesson. Think about it. A man obsessed with dominance, controlling not just property but lives, punished a woman through forced marriage, and yet that act, meant to humiliate and subdue, became his undoing. It is a story repeated in countless forms across cultures. The hubris of the powerful, the patience of the underestimated, the sudden, irreversible reversal. Myths persist because they teach truths humans refuse to see in real time. And this story is a myth disguised as history, a warning etched in human behavior. Archetypally, she embodies the hidden force that exists in every system of oppression. She is the threshold guardian, the shadow, the unexpected agent of transformation. Her body, her mind, her patience, these became instruments of inevitability. And the man, representing arrogance and the illusion of absolute control, became the cautionary figure. This is the psychological pattern that repeats through time. Those who underestimate, who rely on fear to maintain obedience, inevitably create their own downfall. The psychological resonance of this story is profound. It teaches that dominance can never be maintained through fear alone, that intelligence, patience, and awareness can invert power structures in a single, decisive moment, that systems built to suppress are inherently fragile. The mythic dimension amplifies the lesson. It is encoded into human consciousness that those who attempt to control others with cruelty are vulnerable to precisely the reversal they fail to anticipate. And yet, society suppresses these stories. They are uncomfortable because they challenge the illusion of order. They reveal that control is always conditional, that authority is fragile, and that any system which underestimates the human mind will eventually pay a price. Myths survive because they are truths that cannot be fully buried, and this story, this forbidden history, functions in exactly the same way. To understand the night in its fullness, we must strip away the surface and examine it symbolically, psychologically, almost anatomically. Every detail, the flickering candles, the heavy air, the silent anticipation, was part of a pattern, a choreography of power and inevitability. He entered the room expecting to dominate, expecting fear to dictate obedience. But fear can never be forced. It must be earned or manipulated. And she, in the quiet moments before action, had mastered both anticipation and control. Think of it like this: dominance is a dance, and most men learn only the steps they want to see. They assume that intimidation, brute force, or status is enough. But the dance of power is not linear. It is multidimensional. She understood timing, space, presence, and perception. Every inch of movement was calculated to provoke expectation. Every gesture designed to exploit assumptions. The very atmosphere of the room was manipulated as an instrument, and he stepped into it blind, overconfident, unaware that the stage itself had been set against him. Symbolically, this inversion of control is profound. The one expected to submit, weight, size, status, history deemed her inferior, was the actual agent of authority. The supposed instrument of punishment became the embodiment of inevitability. Here is the psychological truth. Perception defines power. He perceived dominance. She perceived opportunity. That gap, the unbridgeable divide between perception and reality, is where catastrophe is born. Every action he attempted reinforced her control. Every assertive gesture, every verbal command, every physical approach was anticipated and neutralized. The night was a living experiment in human psychology, illustrating a principle almost never taught. Power granted by systems, titles, or fear alone is an illusion. Awareness, patience, and strategy are far more potent. One human mind, underestimated and unobserved, can unravel entire hierarchies. And here's the dangerous lesson society tried to erase. Control is conditional. Authority is fragile. Arrogance blinds, even when it is reinforced by law, wealth, and social structure. The choreography of that night exposes a principle repeated across forbidden histories. The unseen, underestimated, and oppressed can and will overtake dominance when circumstances align. The turning point, the moment when inevitability became reality, was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who did not know where to look. It began in the mind. Dominance is a fragile construct. It exists only when the dominant believes the subordinate will comply. That belief is a thread, invisible but essential. Cut it, and the entire edifice collapses. That thread snapped the moment she projected absolute calm, absolute patience, absolute awareness. He did not see it. He could not see it. And that blindness was fatal. Every human mind reacts to expectation. He expected resistance to be weak, obedience to be mechanical, and fear to be constant. But she had mastered the art of anticipation. She understood his rhythm, his predictability, his arrogance. Each move he made to assert control was met with silent counterweight, her body poised, her mind alight, her presence an unyielding force. The psychological imbalance created by his assumptions allowed her to dictate the pace, the pressure, and ultimately the outcome. This is the critical principle hidden in the shadows of history. The illusion of dominance is more dangerous than actual strength. He relied on symbols, size, wealth, social rank, as if they were invincible weapons. But symbols are only effective when the observer acknowledges them as power. She did not. She neutralized them mentally before she ever acted physically. And once perception shifts, action becomes inevitable. The mind that believes it controls reality becomes trapped by the very framework it trusts. The final trigger was almost ceremonial. A misstep, a breath, a moment of hesitation. He leaned on tradition, on expectation, on arrogance. She acted, not out of anger, but out of inevitability. The reversal of power occurred not in brute force alone but in perception, timing, and absolute clarity of purpose. The man who thought himself untouchable discovered too late that domination is only effective when unchallenged in mind, not merely in body. This is a lesson men rarely confront. Control is conditional. Dominance is a fragile performance. And those who underestimate the capacity for awareness, patience, and strategy in others, especially the underestimated, risk catastrophic failure. What he mistook for weakness became the vector of his destruction, and history recorded only fragments of the truth, sanitized for the comfort of those still in power. After the storm, after the irreversible collapse of his power, she did not simply breathe and walk away. Victory carries its own weight, especially when it is born from centuries of oppression and systemic control. In her mind, there was no triumph in the way society would later try to frame it, no celebration of cruelty, no indulgence in malice. Instead, there was clarity, awareness, understanding that the very mechanisms designed to subjugate her, the law, tradition, and social hierarchy, were irrelevant in the face of precise knowledge, patience, and calculated action. She understood something most men never do. Systems are fragile constructs. They rely on compliance, predictability, and the suppression of awareness. When someone steps outside these expected patterns, when they internalize observation, patience, and strategy, they become untouchable, not because they are invincible, but because the machinery that controls others cannot anticipate them. Her mind had become the weapon he never saw coming, the force that operated invisibly until it struck with certainty. And here's the first forbidden truth we must all confront. Survival in an oppressive system does not come from submission. It comes from understanding the architecture of control and using it against itself. The tools of power, the ones he trusted implicitly, were neutralized, inverted, and finally obliterated by insight, timing, and precision. She internalized the lessons of observation and manipulation, demonstrating that intellect and awareness outweigh brute strength in any hierarchy. Yet there is also a darker lesson. Her act, while necessary for survival and vengeance, revealed the fragility of societal arrogance. The institutions that sought to maintain order, slavery, law, and social expectation, failed in the face of one mind that refused to obey. This is a pattern repeated throughout history. Systems of control, no matter how elaborate, are only as strong as the compliance of those within them. One calculated breach can unravel entire hierarchies. Finally, we see that human intelligence, patience, and strategy are often underestimated, especially in those society labels weak. It is a lesson men rarely grasp. The underestimated can be the most formidable. And the moment you recognize this principle, the moment you internalize the mechanics of awareness versus dominance, your understanding of power shifts permanently. Once the event occurred, society moved quickly, not to understand, but to contain. The truth was too dangerous to circulate freely. A man of wealth and status dying at the hands of someone he oppressed threatened the very foundations of social hierarchy. Institutions, gossip networks, and historians conspired, knowingly or unknowingly, to sanitize the narrative. They reduced the story to rumor, minimized her agency, and transformed a calculated act of reversal into something tragic or inexplicable. This is how control works on a societal scale. The narrative itself becomes a weapon. By erasing the power and intelligence of the oppressed, society protects the illusion of order. Those in positions of dominance rely on history to validate their authority, and when an inconvenient truth surfaces, they bury it, distort it, or mythologize it. In this case, the story became a whisper, a cautionary tale twisted, to reassure men that such events were anomalies, not lessons. Institutional manipulation always follows a pattern. First, minimize the threat. Next, recast it in terms of weakness, accident, or randomness. Finally, erase the individual agency that created the invasion of power. In doing so, society preserves confidence in the structures it depends upon. The woman, who acted with calculation and precision, was reduced to an invisible figure, almost erased. Meanwhile, the planter's arrogance became legend, sanitized into cautionary morality tales that obscured the real mechanisms at play. What this reveals is a systemic bias toward maintaining hierarchy. Power relies not just on force, but on control of perception. History, law, social norms, all become tools for perpetuating dominance. And when an individual breaks these expectations, the system reacts aggressively. It erases, it rewrites, it protects the illusion rather than acknowledging reality. The psychological principle here is chilling. Men are trained to look at systems and see stability. They assume that hierarchy guarantees safety. But the truth is far more dangerous. Systems are only as strong as the predictability of those they control. One mind that understands patterns, timing, and leverage can dismantle even the most rigid structure. The erasure of her story is proof that power fears knowledge as much as it fears force. What happened in that house is not just a story of a single night. It is a blueprint, a microcosm of power and collapse repeated throughout human history. Every empire, every institution, every man who believes himself untouchable operates under the same fragile assumptions. They confuse position for power, fear for compliance, and wealth for invincibility. And invariably, when the underestimated act with precision, the illusion shatters. The lesson here is universal. Oppression breeds resistance, and arrogance invites annihilation. Societies that rely solely on intimidation, coercion, or social hierarchy are walking time bombs. Every system has blind spots, every dominator has predictable patterns, and every human mind, even under duress, carries the potential to overturn authority. Her act was extreme, yes, but the principle is consistent. Underestimated minds are capable of extraordinary reversal when the moment aligns with preparation and awareness. This is why forbidden histories matter. They reveal patterns that polite narratives erase. They expose the fragility of what seems permanent, the vulnerability of what seems absolute, and the inevitability of reversal when hubris goes unchecked. Men, in particular, are conditioned to see power as physical, linear, and unquestionable. But the real mechanics are subtle, psychological, and invisible until it is too late. She understood this. He did not. And that divergence in perception was fatal. Every historical collapse, every unexpected act of rebellion, every downfall of the mighty follows the same choreography. The overconfident misreads signals, the system relies on compliance, and the underestimated act with inevitability. The night in Louisiana was a visceral demonstration of this principle. It was not mere vengeance. It was a forensic lesson in the mechanics of dominance, the fragility of control, and the unpredictability of human awareness. And here's the dangerous truth society never wants you to internalize. Your position, your wealth, your muscle, or your status means nothing if your assumptions blind you. Systems are only as strong as the predictability of those they attempt to control. The overlooked, underestimated, or marginalized can become vectors of absolute disruption when strategy, patience, and awareness converge. The ripples of that night extended far beyond the walls of the house, far beyond the immediate tragedy. The event was too destabilizing to remain fully acknowledged. People whispered, adjusted their assumptions, and internalized a subtle fear. Systems are not infallible, and arrogance is vulnerable. Yet the official story was rewritten. The woman's agency was obscured, her strategic brilliance erased. Society attempted to contain the lesson, but the ripple, the quiet, invisible shockwave, continued to spread. The planter's death exposed a critical truth: the collapse of power is contagious. Those who witness the fall of the dominant begin to question the stability of all hierarchies. The illusion of invulnerability cracks, creating subtle shifts in behavior, perception, and ambition. Men who believed they were untouchable suddenly recognized that compliance and fear do not guarantee control. And systems, reliant on these assumptions, begin to wobble even before direct challenge occurs. This is why elites, institutions, and hierarchies fear knowledge. They know that awareness is subversive. One person understanding the true dynamics of power, one mind capable of seeing patterns beneath the surface, can quietly dismantle authority, reshape perception, and create instability that spreads like an unseen virus. Her act, while singular, demonstrates this principle with terrifying clarity. The underestimated can recalibrate the entire structure of dominance without ever needing overt force beyond the critical moment. And it's not just history, it's psychology. Human systems function on predictability. People act within constraints, follow scripts, and rely on assumed obedience. Break the script, introduce calculation and patience, and the system becomes vulnerable. He assumed he understood her, assumed the rules would protect him, assumed dominance was permanent. Each assumption he made became a lever she used to execute inevitability. The ripple continues in every context where power is exercised without comprehension. Corporations, governments, social hierarchies, even personal relationships, they all depend on unexamined obedience. And wherever arrogance underestimates awareness, failure becomes inevitable. The lesson is as much for today as it was in 1846. Never assume the underestimated is powerless. The instruments of control you rely upon are fragile, and your perception is your most vulnerable point. Her story did not die with him. It morphed into myth, legend, and whispered caution. Across generations, narratives like this resurface, not fully understood, never fully recorded, yet carrying encoded truths about power, perception, and reversal. Myths endure because they reveal patterns the conscious mind resists. Arrogance invites destruction, the underestimated can overturn authority, and dominance based on fear alone is fragile. In this sense, her act becomes archetypal. She is the hidden force, the agent of inevitability, the reminder that control is always conditional. The planter represents hubris, entitlement, and reliance on external symbols of power. His death is more than literal, it is symbolic, a warning to anyone who assumes dominance is permanent. Every myth, every legend of the mighty falling to the overlooked, echoes this same psychological truth. Consider the pattern: patience, observation, and precision allow the weak to invert strength. Systems, no matter how sophisticated, cannot anticipate human intelligence that operates outside expected norms. The underdog, the marginalized, the weak, these labels mask potential. And when these individuals recognize the mechanics of dominance, they can strike with inevitability. History sanitizes such events, but myths preserve their essence, embedding lessons in narrative form for those willing to look deeper. There's also a psychological function here. Stories of reversal provide a framework for understanding human behavior and social dynamics. They teach us about timing, perception, and strategy without explicitly stating it. They reveal the fragility of arrogance and the inevitability of consequence when power is mismanaged. They encode wisdom dangerous to those in authority, which is why they survive only in whispers, cautionary tales, and selective folklore. And the most profound lesson for a man listening now is this: dominance is a construct, awareness is the true currency, and the underestimated are often the most capable agents of change. The mechanisms that topple the powerful are not always violent, but they are always inevitable when assumptions remain unchallenged and observation is ignored. The night itself was a battlefield, but not one of brute force alone. It was a clash of perception, anticipation, and psychological control, a contest fought in silence, in gesture, in the weight of presence. He entered, expecting compliance, expecting fear, expecting his dominance to operate like clockwork. But dominance exists only when assumed by both parties. And she had never assumed it. Every movement he made was mirrored, anticipated, neutralized, not recklessly, but deliberately. The psychological pressure he tried to exert bounced back against him like invisible steel. Men trained to dominate rarely perceive subtlety. They expect resistance to be linear, predictable, and compliant. But human behavior is multidimensional, and when one mind perceives the patterns of another, control can invert in a heartbeat. In this room, fear was not submission, it was awareness. And awareness is the deadliest instrument in a hierarchy built on arrogance. He saw her body and assumed limitation. He saw her status and assumed inferiority. But she had transformed both into leverage. Each breath, each pause, each gesture became a trigger. His psychology, reliant on assumptions and entitlement, became the mechanism of his undoing. This is the hidden truth of dominance. It is fragile, conditional, and dependent on perception. Systems, laws, and social codes only extend as far as the compliance of those they govern. He relied on tradition, expectation, and the predictable rhythms of social power. She relied on calculation, patience, and the invisible leverage of inevitability. And in this clash of awareness versus assumption, the outcome was already written, long before the first physical act occurred. The psychological mechanics are precise. He believed he controlled reality. She manipulated his perception of it. He interpreted silence as weakness. She used it to measure timing. He acted on arrogance. She acted on inevitability. The dance of dominance, subjugation, and reversal reached its peak not in physical confrontation alone, but in the mind, the unseen battlefield where certainty collapses under awareness. Tonight, this is the principle you must grasp. Control is never absolute. Dominance is never guaranteed. And when you underestimate the capacity for calculation, patience, and perception in another, you invite consequences that are both immediate and irreversible. The final moments were the physical manifestation of the psychological inevitability that had been building all night. Every second of anticipation, every calculated pause, every subtle exertion of presence coalesced into action. The planter, blinded by arrogance and expectation, moved as if control were a guarantee. He did not see the invisible threads weaving his downfall, the pattern she had mapped in her mind long before. What followed was swift, precise, and unavoidable. Her body, which he had once mocked, became the instrument of his undoing. Every ounce, every leverage point, every movement he believed he commanded was anticipated and counted. This was not brute rage. It was execution, methodical and inevitable. The weight of centuries of oppression, the intelligence honed under forced subjugation, and the patience of observation converged in a single, decisive act. He fell not merely because of force, but because of miscalculation. Men like him mistake strength for invincibility, intimidation for obedience, and predictability for control. But she had seen through all of it. She understood timing, positioning, and the vulnerabilities created by arrogance. When perception and physicality aligned, the collapse was absolute. The instruments he trusted, size, wealth, status, were neutralized before the first strike landed. And this is why forbidden histories are dangerous. They reveal that the illusion of control is fragile, that the underestimated are often more capable than the confident realize, and that systems of dominance fail when human intelligence operates outside expected patterns. The physical outcome was inevitable because the psychological architecture of power had already been inverted. He did not die because she acted faster. He died because he misunderstood reality. The lesson is profound. Dominance without comprehension is temporary. Control without awareness is illusion. And arrogance that ignores observation, patience, and calculation is fatal. History rarely records the mechanisms, only the final act. But when you reconstruct the truth, you see the inevitability, the strategy, and the lesson hidden beneath. After the planter's death, society faced a problem far larger than grief or scandal. The truth threatened the foundations of hierarchy itself. A man of wealth, status, and social dominance had been undone by someone society deemed inferior. The lesson was intolerable. Control is conditional, dominance is fragile, and arrogance can blind even the most powerful. And so, the story was rewritten. Narratives are tools of control. By erasing agency and sanitizing details, society preserves the illusion of order. The woman, who had acted with deliberate strategy and precision, was reduced to a passive figure, her intelligence obscured. Accounts minimized her role, attributing the outcome to accident, chance, or his own misfortune. The act of rebellion, perfectly calculated and inevitable, was softened to protect those still in positions of power. This pattern repeats endlessly. Systems of hierarchy, wealth, and social control rely on narrative manipulation. History is not impartial. It is a weapon in the hands of those who benefit from perceived stability. When inconvenient truths arise, when the underestimated strike, when arrogance collapses, the response is to rewrite reality, to sanitize, to mythologize, and to erase agency. Her story became a whisper, preserved only in fragments, because acknowledging her intellect and strategy would undermine the illusion of dominance everywhere. But here lies the forbidden lesson. Narrative manipulation cannot erase principles. The mechanics of power, the fragility of dominance, and the inevitability of reversal remain true, regardless of how society spins the story. The underestimated can always invert control, exploit arrogance, and collapse systems when patterns are recognized and leveraged. The erasure of her agency is not a sign that her act was insignificant. It is proof that society fears the principles she revealed. Men listening now must internalize this. Dominance is a fragile construct. Control depends on perception, compliance, and predictability. Systems fail when these assumptions are disrupted, and arrogance blinds the powerful to the risk. The true power lies not in position or force, but in observation, patience, and awareness, tools the underestimated wield to devastating effect. The story of that night is more than historical curiosity. It is a lens into the mechanics of power and human behavior. Her act exposes universal truths. Systems of control are fragile, arrogance blinds, and perception shapes reality. Every hierarchy, every institution, every man who believes in his invulnerability operates under assumptions that can be exploited, inverted, and destroyed by awareness and strategy. This is the principle most men fail to grasp. Dominance is conditional. It relies on predictability, compliance, and the misperception of strength. Her victory was not mere chance. It was inevitability, forged from observation, patience, and understanding. The planter believed he controlled reality. He did not. And the difference between assumption and awareness is the difference between life and obliteration. History rarely records these lessons accurately. It sanitizes, mythologizes, and erases uncomfortable truths to maintain social cohesion. But the underlying patterns remain. Arrogance is always vulnerable, authority always conditional, and those underestimated can wield calculated power capable of reshaping the structures around them. Her act is an archetypal example of this principle. The overlooked individual, armed with perception and timing, can dismantle systems built to suppress them. Psychologically, this story is a blueprint. It illustrates how perception governs dominance, how patience can invert power, and how underestimation becomes fatal. Men are conditioned to seek control through force, status, and intimidation, but these tools are fragile. Awareness, calculation, and strategic patience are far more potent. The underestimated, when fully aware, are often the ultimate arbiters of consequence. And there is a subtle, dangerous lesson for any man watching now. Systems you trust, hierarchies you respect, even traditions you assume immutable, none are absolute. If you fail to anticipate resistance, if you misread awareness, if you rely solely on intimidation or compliance, you risk collapse. The planter's story is not just a historical event, it is a psychological case study, a warning, and a lesson encoded into human behavior across centuries. Society feared her long after the night ended, not because she was physically dangerous, but because she exposed a systemic vulnerability that no institution could acknowledge. A single act had revealed the fragility of dominance, the conditional nature of power, and the fatal flaws of arrogance. And institutions, built to preserve hierarchy, cannot survive if their fragility is widely recognized. So they acted, They erased her agency, muted her intelligence, and reshaped the narrative to make the outcome seem like chance, misfortune, or accident. This is the essence of systemic manipulation. Control extends beyond action into narrative. By controlling the story, society maintains the illusion of order. By silencing inconvenient truths, it reassures the powerful that hierarchy is stable, dominance is permanent, and arrogance is safe. The moment the underestimated demonstrates capability, institutions panic. And the response is always the same: rewrite, minimize, sanitize, and mythologize to obscure the real lesson. The danger of her story is psychological. It threatens assumptions. It forces recognition of the hidden dynamics underlying control, the fragility of status, and the inevitability of reversal when perception and awareness are ignored. Her intelligence, patience, and precision created a blueprint for those willing to study it, a forbidden guide to understanding power, hierarchy, and strategy that society prefers remain hidden. And here lies the enduring principle: systems fear knowledge more than action. Institutions survive not by eliminating threats, they survive by obscuring principles. By erasing her role, society ensured that the mechanics of her victory were hidden, but the pattern remains, repeating endlessly whenever arrogance meets underestimated awareness. Any observer can see the same threads in history: the mighty undone, the overlooked triumphant, and the illusion of control collapsing under the weight of perception. Men listening now must grasp this truth: authority, hierarchy, and dominance are illusions unless recognized and validated by perception. The underestimated, armed with awareness and patience, can dismantle entire structures without warning. History erases them to protect the illusion, but the lessons remain encoded in myth, rumor, and the whispers of forbidden knowledge. The principles revealed that night are not confined to the 19th century. They echo in every system of control today. Corporations, governments, social hierarchies, even intimate relationships, all operate on the same fragile assumptions: compliance, predictability, and the illusion of invulnerability. The underestimated, observant, and patient can exploit these assumptions to invert power, often without anyone realizing until it is too late. Consider modern parallels. Leaders rely on authority, prestige, and ritual to maintain dominance. They trust systems, rules, and fear to enforce obedience. But these are illusions. Awareness, strategy, and timing can dismantle hierarchies faster than brute force. Just like she did, the underestimated in today's world can leverage subtle miscalculations, blind spots, and predictable behaviors to achieve results that defy the expectations of the powerful. This is why forbidden knowledge is dangerous. It exposes patterns elite institutions rely upon to maintain control. One mind that sees through assumptions, observes patterns, and waits for inevitability can disrupt organizations, topple leaders, and collapse hierarchies without warning. History repeats itself precisely because most people fail to internalize these lessons. The planter's story is a blueprint for the mechanics of reversal, preserved in myth, rumor, and the fragments that escaped erasure. Arrogance blinds. Authority misinterprets silence as compliance. Systems assume permanence when none exists. And those who understand this, who internalize the interplay between perception, strategy, and inevitability, gain insight far beyond raw power. The underestimated are always more dangerous than the obviously strong, because they act precisely when their opponents are least prepared, exploiting the very assumptions that enforce dominance. Men watching this must realize the timeless principle: strength alone does not guarantee survival. Control is always conditional, and perception governs reality. The lessons of that night in 1846 are alive in boardrooms, courtrooms, and governments today. Hubris blinds, systems fail, and the underestimated act with inevitability. And the consequences for those who ignore these principles are catastrophic. Understanding the mechanics of that night does more than illuminate history. It awakens a fundamental shift in perception. Once you grasp how dominance can invade, how arrogance blinds, and how awareness becomes the ultimate weapon, your relationship with power itself transforms. You no longer see strength as brute force or position as invulnerability. You begin to see the hidden currents beneath every hierarchy, every interaction, every decision. This is a dangerous awareness because it strips away illusions. You recognize the fragility of systems, the predictability of the arrogant, and the inevitability of consequences when observation and calculation are ignored. Men who internalize this knowledge perceive patterns others miss. They anticipate weakness, exploit blind spots, and understand that compliance is never guaranteed. It must be earned, or anticipated, or leveraged. The psychological effect is profound. You begin to measure not only actions but intentions. You observe how perception shapes reality, how assumptions dictate outcomes, and how patience can turn the underestimated into the ultimate vector of consequence. This awareness cultivates power that is invisible, strategic, and untouchable. It is no longer about muscle, status, or intimidation. It is about mastery of mind, environment, and timing. And here's the hidden danger. Once you see this, you cannot unsee it. You begin to detect arrogance in the powerful, miscalculations in systems, and patterns of inevitable collapse wherever dominance relies on fear or assumptions. Every hierarchy becomes a chessboard, every interaction a test of awareness, and every position of authority potentially vulnerable. The knowledge changes how you act, how you observe, and how you anticipate. It awakens a new level of strategic consciousness that is both empowering and isolating. For men seeking mastery, this is the turning point. The story of that night is no longer just history. It becomes a mirror, a lesson, a blueprint. And those who truly internalize it begin to operate on a level few perceive, turning observation into inevitability and patience into leverage. The underestimated become the architects of consequence. The lessons of that night are not merely historical, they are practical. Observation, patience, and understanding the mechanics of dominance can be applied deliberately to life, systems, and human interactions today. Every hierarchy, whether corporate, social, or personal, relies on assumptions that those beneath you will comply, that your position guarantees authority, that fear enforces obedience. Break these assumptions, and control shifts. Start with perception. Watch patterns, habits, and reactions. Dominance depends on predictability. Disruption depends on awareness. The underestimated mind learns to anticipate, measure, and exploit the blind spots of the arrogant. Every word spoken, every gesture made, every pause observed becomes data. The more you see, the more leverage you acquire, and the more inevitable your influence becomes. Next, patience. She did not act recklessly. She waited until every factor aligned perfectly. Timing is the silent weapon of strategy. Acting too early exposes vulnerability. Acting too late allows the system to regain balance. Mastery comes from aligning awareness with action, waiting for inevitability to manifest, then executing decisively. In life and systems, patience converts observation into power. Finally, leverage. The tools of dominance, the assumptions, the routines, the conventions, can all be inverted. A weak position can become strength, compliance can be manipulated into inevitability, and underestimation can be weaponized. This is the principle she exemplified. The instruments of oppression, when studied carefully, can be tamed into vectors of reversal. The dangerous truth is this: knowledge of these mechanics creates power that is invisible but absolute. Systems fail, arrogance collapses, and the underestimated can reshape reality when preparation meets opportunity. Few men understand this principle, and fewer act on it consciously, but those who do operate on a plane beyond fear, hierarchy, or brute force. Every man who believes himself untouchable carries invisible blind spots, psychological vulnerabilities that are consistent, predictable, and exploitable. Arrogance blinds the mind to subtle cues. Overconfidence masks hesitation. Assumptions about obedience create openings. She exploited these blind spots with surgical precision. Understanding them is key for anyone seeking mastery over systems, people, and hierarchies. Blind spots are rarely obvious. They exist in patterns, the predictable reaction to challenge, the reliance on fear as a substitute for respect, the misinterpretation of silence as compliance. Most men do not detect these weaknesses because they assume dominance is permanent. Yet these gaps are the lever points of control. Observation transforms them from hidden dangers into actionable insight. Every misread, every assumption, every unconscious reliance on status becomes a vector for influence. Exploiting blind spots requires patience and subtlety. It is not brute force but anticipation, timing, and psychological leverage. She observed, calculated, and waited. Every gesture, Every word, every pause was a test, measuring reaction, confirming assumptions, and refining strategy. Her act was not impulsive. It was inevitable because she understood the architecture of his arrogance and the predictable vulnerabilities of his mind. These principles apply universally. In organizations, in personal interactions, in systems of authority, the arrogant overestimate their control. The underestimated, by contrast, can invert dynamics by identifying assumptions, exploiting predictability, and acting when conditions are perfectly aligned. Awareness plus patience equals inevitability. Action becomes the natural culmination of understanding. And this is why forbidden knowledge is dangerous. It gives men insight into what systems and arrogant minds rely upon, and shows how control can be inverted without brute force. The mechanics are subtle, psychological, and invisible, yet utterly decisive when applied. Recognizing blind spots transforms perception into leverage, and leverage into absolute consequence. Knowledge of these mechanics carries a weight few dare acknowledge. Understanding how to exploit blind spots, anticipate behavior, and invert dominance is not just a strategic advantage, it is transformative. Once you see the fragility of systems, the predictability of arrogance, and the inevitability of reversal, your perception of power, morality, and identity begins to shift. You are no longer a participant in illusions. You become a master of them. This transformation is subtle but profound. Men conditioned to rely on force, status, or fear discover that true influence is psychological, invisible, and inevitable when applied correctly. Morality becomes a tool, not a limitation. Ethics are no longer dictated solely by society, but by the consequences of understanding human behavior. You learn to navigate systems not through obedience or brute strength, but through comprehension, strategy, and anticipation. The danger, of course, is double-edged. Awareness can isolate. Once you perceive the fragility of dominance and the inevitability of reversal, you recognize arrogance and miscalculation everywhere. You see patterns in institutions, leaders, and hierarchies that others blindly trust. This knowledge empowers, but it also separates. You begin to understand the structures that govern behavior in ways others cannot perceive. You become, in a sense, untouchable, but also hyper-aware. This is precisely what forbidden history teaches. The underestimated can shape reality because the dominant assumes compliance. Systems collapse when arrogance blinds them to observation and inevitability. And for those who internalize this lesson, the mind itself becomes the ultimate instrument of power, strategic, patient, and invisible. She wielded this mind, this awareness, with devastating effect. Her act was not just vengeance. It was a masterclass in the architecture of dominance, the fragility of systems, and the mechanics of reversal. For men ready to internalize this knowledge, there is no going back. Once you understand these principles, you see the undercurrents of every hierarchy, the blind spots of every leader, and the leverage hidden in every underestimated individual. Your perception, your patience, and your awareness become weapons more potent than status, strength, or wealth. The reverberations of a single act like haze extend far beyond the immediate moment. History is full of similar reversals, moments when the underestimated strike and systems collapse. Societies attempt to erase, sanitize, or mythologize these events, but the principles remain. These ripple effects shape culture, psychology, and behavior for generations. They are warnings encoded into folklore, literature, and whispered stories, lessons hidden in plain sight for those willing to see. Every time arrogance meets observation, every time dominance relies on assumed compliance, the potential for reversal exists. Her act became a blueprint, whether consciously or unconsciously repeated. Patience, awareness, and calculated action can dismantle authority without brute force. Even when the story is erased, the lesson persists. Culture absorbs it, patterns repeat, and history remembers through echoes rather than documents. The ripple is not just societal, it is personal. Men who internalize these lessons see the fragility in every system, the predictable failures of overconfidence, and the invisible leverage that the underestimated wield. They recognize that real power is psychological, anticipatory, and invisible until deployed. Once internalized, this knowledge transforms perception, making arrogance everywhere a vulnerability, and observation the ultimate weapon. These ripples also shape strategy across generations. Leaders, corporations, and institutions evolve, sometimes too slowly, to counteract the lessons encoded in these reversals. The underestimated continue to exploit blind spots, and the cycles of hubris and collapse repeat endlessly. Those who understand the pattern can predict, manipulate, and control outcomes far beyond their apparent position. And here is the dangerous truth. History protects hierarchy not by preventing these reversals, but by rewriting them, hiding the mechanisms, and obscuring agency. Yet the mechanics remain, encoded in the patterns of human behavior. Those who study them, who internalize inevitability, awareness, and timing, gain insight that transcends status, force, or tradition. They learn to wield strategy like a shadow, silent, invisible, and absolute. Now, it is time to anchor this knowledge, not as theory, but as lived understanding. I want you to engage with it actively. Consider a symbolic phrase, "The unseen moves first." Repeat it silently in your mind twice. Let the weight of the words sink into your awareness. This is not idle repetition. It is a ritual of cognition, a way to internalize the mechanics of observation, patience, and inevitability. Think of every system you encounter, every hierarchy, every relationship. See the blind spots, anticipate the predictable assumptions, and recognize where leverage exists. Imagine yourself moving unseen, measuring every response, calculating timing, and acting when inevitability aligns. This is the mindset she wielded, a mind that saw through arrogance, patience that waited for perfect alignment, and strategy that turned the underestimated into an unstoppable force. By repeating this phrase, you commit to recognizing the invisible currents of power wherever they flow. You anchor perception as a tool, patience as leverage, and awareness as your ultimate weapon. The principle is simple: domination is only absolute when the dominant believes it is, and perception can invert reality in a heartbeat. The underestimated can reshape any hierarchy when timing, observation, and inevitability converge. This is your cognitive activation. It is a shift from passive understanding to strategic awareness. Every arrogance-based assumption you encounter becomes an opportunity. Every system that seems untouchable becomes a puzzle to be observed, understood, and leveraged. This is the transformation forbidden histories offer: the ability to see, anticipate, and act where others blindly assume control. Internalize it fully. Repeat the phrase silently twice: "The unseen moves first." Feel it settle in your mind, embedding the principles of awareness, patience, and inevitability. Let it guide your perception, sharpen your strategy, and recalibrate your understanding of dominance and control. Once this is internalized, the underestimated no longer exist outside your awareness. They become the force you understand and anticipate, shaping the outcomes of every interaction. The story ends, but its lesson is eternal. The plant is arrogance, the illusion of control, and the underestimation of a single mind created an outcome that was absolute and irreversible. History tried to erase her. Society tried to sanitize the mechanics, but the truth persists. Dominance is conditional, perception governs reality, and the underestimated hold the ultimate power when awareness, patience, and timing converge. Understand this clearly. No amount of wealth, size, status, or intimidation guarantees control. Systems collapse when assumptions go unchallenged, and arrogance blinds the powerful to subtle currents. The underestimated act with inevitability, exploiting every blind spot, turning the instruments of oppression into tools of reversal. This is not myth. This is human behavior, repeated across centuries, encoded in forbidden histories, whispered in legends, and now revealed to you in full. The final lesson is brutal but transformative. Power is not in dominance, it is in comprehension. Strength lies not in force, but in observation. Survival depends not on compliance, but on awareness. And those who internalize this understand a truth few men ever confront. Reality bends to perception. Arrogance invites downfall. Blindness to strategy invites annihilation. And awareness, patience, and calculated action become invisible instruments of irreversible consequence. For the man who absorbs this knowledge, everything changes. You see systems not as static, but as fragile constructs. You perceive patterns others overlook, exploit assumptions that others trust blindly, and act with inevitability when opportunity aligns. You understand that the underestimated are never weak. They are latent vectors of transformation. And once you internalize this, you operate on a plane beyond conventional fear, hierarchy, or force. History, society, and even human nature conspire to obscure these truths, but now, they are yours. Remember the symbolic phrase, the unseen moves first. Let it guide you, anchor your perception, and sharpen your strategy. Let it remind you that arrogance blinds, that systems fail, and that the underestimated, when fully aware, always have the power to invert reality. This is the final descent into forbidden knowledge. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You are now awake to the mechanics of dominance, the inevitability of reversal, and the ultimate principle of human behavior. Perception is power, awareness is weapon, and the underestimated are the architects of consequence.